All right, the last online lecture for foreign policy left off. Missiles are in Cuba. The United States, Kennedy discovers these missiles. At first, there's a big question mark about whether or not he should tell the Soviets or make it public that he knows that those missiles are there. There's a lot of pressure to basically use a preemptive strike against those missiles, thinking they're not operational. Remember, there's the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy's a young president. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on him to act quickly and decisively. Now, on the flip side, you have to take a look at why do the Soviets put these missiles in Cuba? And one of the things is there was this fear in the Soviet Union that there was a missile gap and that the Soviets had far fewer missiles than the U.S. And the way you equalize this gap is apparently to watch a film with THX. Is you put missiles in Cuba, therefore kind of equalizing the situation. Another motivation of the Soviet Union is to protect Cuba. Remember, the U.S. had tried to get rid of Castro. Cuba is an ally they have on the Western Hemisphere, and so there is that goal. Another thing is the U.S. had missiles pointing at the Soviet Union over in Turkey. Remember, ever since the Truman Doctrine, the United States had pledged its support to defending against communism in Greece and Turkey and the rest of Europe. So there were missiles, as Turkey was part of NATO, in Turkey. So the United States discovered these missiles are there, and Kennedy has to respond. And basically what Kennedy does is he orders an embargo. He puts a blockade, even though they don't call it a blockade because a blockade is an act of war. They do a embargo of Cuba. He goes on television on October 22nd and basically denounces what the Soviet Union is doing, and he says the U.S. will quarantine Cuba. And basically what that means is they won't let anything in. While that buys Kennedy and the U.S. time, it also doesn't deal with the problem, which is the missiles are still there. You can keep stuff from coming in or stuff from going out, but what if those missiles are operational and you're wasting time? So Kennedy goes on television. He orders a blockade. He's careful not to call it a blockade in his speech because technically a blockade is an act of war. And he follows up that with basically the United States is on full red alert. They are ready. Troops are going into Florida in mass numbers. Planes are called with nuclear capability. And there's still, throughout this crisis, a lot of pressure for Kennedy to strike. Because, once again, there's this feeling that the missiles were not operational. Why not knock them out before they become operational? There is a huge amount of kind of tension and drama that develops over these 13 days. And the blockade is called around the island of Cuba. The sites of the missiles are right there. U.S. forces are mobilizing in Florida and throughout the southern United States. There's a tremendous number of near missed, moments where this could have led to a all-out war. For one instance, boats are coming towards, Soviet ships are coming towards the blockade. U.S. ships accidentally, one of the commanders fires over them, some warning shells. There was a moment where the Soviets possibly could have responded. More U-2 spy planes were flying over Cuba to get more information about the status of the missiles. One of the individuals was shot down and killed, and Kennedy is very careful not to make that information public at the time because that would possibly call for further strikes. There's a lot of things going on. The movie 13 Days does a really good job at basically going over this crisis. In terms of numbers, you have 180 U.S. naval ships surrounding the island. You have 250,000 troops mobilized in the southern part of the United States. You have B-52 bombers getting ready. This stuff is basically pretty intense. And like I said, there was a lot of things that could have potentially triggered a big war. Both sides, though, demonstrate a huge amount of restraint because no one wants to see this thing get nuclear. They do reach a settlement. In fact, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, at the time, basically said, We were eyeball to eyeball with the Russians, and they just blinked. And the settlement was one that basically both sides could walk away from and not look like they gave in. And here it is. The missiles are not getting into Cuba.
Thug life.
The United States had more conventional troops in the Western Hemisphere, so the Soviets know you could launch missiles, but that's probably not an option because that means the U.S. will do the same over in Eastern Europe and whatnot. So they're outmatched there.
Thug life.
The alternative to not compromising would be unthinkable: mutual assured destruction.
Thug life.
And really, a lot of world opinion backed the United States. Basically, the Soviets are seen as, once again, acting very aggressively, putting in missiles in places they were not previously in place. And after kind of a lot of messages being sent back and forth, ignoring messages, on October 27th, both sides reach an agreement. And basically, Kennedy says, we will not invade Cuba. We will not attempt it any longer. So Khrushchev gets that. And in exchange, the missiles will be removed from the island of Cuba and basically taken out. Now, another part of this, and one of those things they may ask you, all of the following were part of the Cuban Missile Crisis settlement. The United States, Kennedy agrees to secretly remove the missiles, U.S. missiles, in Turkey later on. And the reason why Kennedy has to do it secretly is he does not want to look like he's backing down to the Soviets. Politically, that would be dangerous. International opinion would, it looks like we're weak. Kennedy agrees to remove those missiles, partly because they're already outdated and they're old anyways, but it's his way of giving in to Khrushchev a bit so that the settlement could be reached. The crazy thing about this Cuban Missile Crisis, we would not know until after the Cold War was over. The Soviet missiles in Cuba had nuclear capabilities. The people in the island of Cuba had the authority to use those missiles. And if Kennedy would have listened to his generals and attacked, there is a very good chance the Soviets would have responded and you would have had all-out atomic war. So good stuff that he doesn't. Kennedy, though, shortly after this crisis, basically announces hopes of relaxing tensions. Throughout the Cold War, you're going to see this. Eisenhower did it with the Spirit of Geneva, the suspension of atmospheric testing. Remember that was ruined by the U-2 spy plane incident. But Kennedy will try to get tensions relaxed, partly because things were getting pretty intense during this part of the Cold War. And later on, this relaxation of tensions will get a name called détente. They do some things to relax tensions. They do end up negotiating some treaties, outline atmospheric testing and underwater nuclear testing, kind of formalizing those previous agreements with the atmosphere through a treaty. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a hotline is established in the Washington, D.C. and Moscow so that the U.S. and the Soviets can immediately communicate with one another to avoid miscommunication, which could lead to a big, big war. There's a whole thing about Kennedy Monroe. We won't get into that because that's like TMZ gossip. If we had time in class, I would, of course, waste your time by babbling about it. Kennedy, if you watch the foreign policy lecture, you know that Kennedy is unfortunately going to be in Dallas in November of 1963, preparing for the 1964 presidential campaign, and while riding in the car, he is gunned down. There he is on the day of his death in November 22nd, 1963, and Kennedy in the convertible in which he was, waving to the crowd and whatnot. If you have a particular sick sense of wonder and you're wondering what this event looked like, take a look at the Zapruder film. You will see it slowed down and every conspiracy theorist in the world talking about who killed Kennedy and the secret shooter and all those other things. So Kennedy's dead. We don't really know what he would have done otherwise with regard to Vietnam. Remember, he allowed Diem to be killed by members of his own military. He does, come down. He becomes a martyr because when he gets killed shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, people want to remember him fondly following his death. So there is the assassination video. This is actually the gun that Lee Harvey Oswald used, even though not everyone agrees that he is the lone gunman. Most historians do argue that he was killed by one man and one man only. Kennedy's dead. Goodbye, Kennedy. Once again, Kennedy does, or rather he was the president who escalated our involvement in Vietnam with the increase in military advisors. But of course it will be Lyndon Johnson who will be the one who will clearly escalate our role in Vietnam following the Gulf of Tonkin, Operation Rolling Thunder, the Tet Offensive, all of those things you'll see in the Vietnam War lecture. So Johnson's president. None of the stuff about Kennedy or Johnson I'm going to get into detail, but basically just kind of as you read it through the book, pick on kind of some of the foreign policy things that they did. Kennedy killed, Johnson taking the oath of office. Now, Johnson is really two big things about Johnson: Great Society and his role in Vietnam. Just keep in mind that his policies under the Great Society are going to be undermined by his lack of support at home and his inability to pay for those programs because of the spending in the war in Vietnam. So really, Johnson does do other things. It's not just Vietnam, but really it's going to be Vietnam that's going to dominate Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy. There were slogans, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So he lost a lot of support from both liberals and conservatives. Conservatives never really supported him anyways because of his perceived lying about the war and things like that. So goodbye to Johnson. Nixon, he wins. And I will be covering all the Nixon non-Vietnam War stuff in the class lecture. Nixon's elected. Who is this guy? President from 69 to 74, the only president ever to resign from office following the Watergate scandal. Hardcore Republican, Mr. Anti-Communist himself. Former Vice President Nixon is the guy. And he has to be mentioned along with his Secretary of State. This guy, Henry Kissinger, is going to be key to the Nixon administration and a very controversial figure, Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger was one of the huge kind of like essential guys in the whole Nixon administration. He came up with a lot of the policies along with Nixon, and he was a practitioner of what is known as Realpolitik. Realpolitik is basically a German word which means foreign policy should be based upon realism, self-interest, not dictated by idealism. And basically what that means is sometimes you're going to negotiate with the communists, even if you don't like communism. Sometimes you're going to go against your values or your ideals in pursuit of the nation's best interests. So that's Kissinger and Nixon's Realpolitik. There's a whole bunch of stuff with regard to Vietnam that this applies to. But Nixon has his own doctrine. And lucky for you, you have the Nixon Doctrine, you have the Eisenhower Doctrine, you have the Truman Doctrine. They're pretty easy to kind of remember because they're named after the president. And Nixon's doctrine was rather interesting. He said basically the U.S. can't be defending everybody all over the world. We can't be putting out every fire every time there's a fire, which would be symbolic of communist rising or whatnot. We can't put our finger in every hole. That didn't come out right. We can't, what's the saying? Can't plug your finger in all the holes of the dam. Whatever the saying is. The U.S. cannot do everything at every time. We need our little homies.
There's a story about my little homie, straight thuggin', little bad young.
And our little homies are allies in most cases of aggression. such as insurrections, rebellions, non-nuclear threats, Americans' allies would be expected to use their own manpower for their own defense. We would not be the military protector of the world. So we will be a partner. We will help with money, training, pats on back, inspirational speeches, things like that. But we're not going to be all over the world sending our troops to every corner in every third world country that needs assistance. We will support, but we will not do it all. And so that's his approach, and that's going to be part of his policy, really, in Vietnam. Vietnamization. And basically, we are going to be giving economic and limited military aid. But, for example, in Vietnam, Vietnamization, the United States will train Vietnamese troops, South Vietnamese troops, to do the fighting on their own behalf. So this is Nixon's approach. It's cost effective because the U.S. is not having to go all over the world. It also is more realistic. We can't do it all. We had seen the Cold War start in Europe, go over to Asia with China and Korea, go over to the Middle East with Egypt and other parts with Iran. We had it go to Latin America with Guatemala and Cuba and going over to places like... So that's Nixon's approach. Now, the ironic situation is Nixon is the guy who is going to preside as president during this relaxation of tensions, détente. He's the guy, the most hardcore anti-communist guy on earth, is the guy who is going to relax tensions with the communist Soviets and the communist Chinese. Now here is why. China. Last time we saw it, it was invading the Yalu River and pushing the UN all the way back across the 38th parallel. Prior to that, they had been in a civil war between the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek and the communist Mao. And of course, Mao wins in 1949. Everyone's freaking out. Truman, how in the heck did you lose China? And there is this kind of criticism of the Democrats of being soft on communism, of being weak. And ever since that, no president, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, had acknowledged the existence of the People's Republic of China. We did not trade with it. We did not have diplomats over there. We did not have anything to do with China. We continued to support the other China. And if you go back over here, the other China is mainland China, which is the communist side, but also Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek and his supporters fled to. So you have two Chinas. You have Mao's.
Yeah, I'm Chinese. And what? Yeah, you know who this is. Jin, let me tell you this. The days of the pork fried rice and the chicken wings coming to ya. Yeah,
And
I'm
you have
and
Chiang
what?
Kai-shek.
Yeah, you know who this is. Jin, let me tell you this. The days of the pork fried rice and the chicken wings coming to your house by me is over.
Y'all gonna learn Chinese. It's my jam right there. So you have these two Chinas, right? And we didn't want to recognize the guys on the left or your right, depending upon if you're watching this in a mirror or something. We support Chiang Kai-shek, Taiwan, the non-communist China. And that's where it had been kind of left. Now, here's the thing. Nixon, the guy who hates communism probably more than anybody else. In fact, there's rumors that Nixon, when he would wake up in the morning, he would take two Russian kids, put them in the blender, blend them up, and drink them for protein. That's how much he hated communism. Hated it. Hated it. Hated it as much as Dikey hates me. That's how much Nixon hated China. Hated it as much as Sarah hates doing homework. Hated it. Hated it. Hated it. Hated it. As much as... I don't know. I'm out of it. I hope I haven't offended anybody. Now, here's what happens.
There's an old Balkan proverb. Only Nixon could go to China.
Only Nixon can go to China. Here's the thing. Nixon could go to China. He could go there and talk to them and not be accused of being weak on communism because he has a track record of doing nothing but hating communism. Alger Hiss, all that stuff. So Nixon begins to consider reopening of relations, or what is called as reapproachment. Now, there's some reasons for it. Think about it. What advantage can we possibly gain from talking to China? There's a couple.
Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come.
China's a huge market economically ever since back in the days. Open door policy under William McKinley, Secretary of State John Hay, review. So there's that. The other option, or the other reason, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And China and the Soviets were not exactly best friends. And Nixon wanted to increase Sino-Soviet tensions, Chinese-Soviet tensions. There was a variety of issues and a variety of reasons why these two sides didn't get along. And Nixon knew you talk to one, the other one's going to be more willing to kind of accommodate. It's keeping your options open. When you are in demand, other countries want to talk to you. It goes to dating too. Got a lot of people that think you're good looking, then a lot of people want to date you. No one's checking you out, no one will continue to check you out. When it rains, it pours. I digress.
There's an old Balkan proverb. Only Nixon could go to China.
In fact, the first group to actually go to China is, of all things, the ping pong team. They received a invitation to go to the People's Republic of China in April 1971, and they're the first Americans ever to go officially to communist China since the end of the Chinese Civil War, and it's a huge success because the American public is seeing Americans playing against Chinese people and realizing they're not zombies that like spit Marxist fireballs at people. They're people. And the American public becomes more willing to this idea that China could be a potential place for America to be involved with. And what ends up happening is shortly after the trip, the trade embargo, which had been in place for over 20 years, is lifted. There's this idea, and this is actually a quote that one, I believe, the American ping pong players, this is his reaction when he returns. They are people just like us. They are real. They are genuine. They got feeling. I made friends. I made genuine friends, you see. The country is similar to America, but still very different. It's beautiful. They got the Great Wall. They got plains over there. They got an ancient palace. The parks. There's streams, and they got ghosts that haunt. There's all kinds of, animals. The country changes from the south to the north. The people, they have a unity. They really believe in their Maoism. Now, I forget if that's an American ping pong player. I believe it is. But basically, this is this realization that, wow, they're not that different. Yeah, they're communists. Yeah, they have a different economic system. But we could probably find some common ground. Shortly after the ping pong trip, Henry Kissinger starts secret negotiations with China. There's Kissinger over the left doing his secret handshake stuff, creepy grin. They start talking to the Chinese secretly. Another reason to talk to China is maybe they can help us out with the Vietnam situation. By the early 1970s, we're trying to get the hell out of Vietnam. And so talking to China about potentially helping us do that. Kissinger visits in 1971. There he is once again talking with Mao. During the visit, there's a potential, they float the idea, what if we bring Tricky Nick over here? You interested?
There's an old Balkan proverb. Only Nixon could go to China.
And this is important to point out, and I think I've said it, but here it is again. For a Democrat, negotiating with the communist nation of China would have been basically political suicide. But for Republican Nixon, hardcore anti-communist, the coldest of the cold warriors, somebody called him, he could get away with it. And so what ends up happening is the groundwork is laid for an historic visit.
What a difference a day made. 24 little hours. What the sun.
I don't know what happened there, but apparently it stopped. So we got panda bears out of it. Nixon goes to China. Air Force One lands in China. The first president ever to go to China. Nixon's there. He's shaking hands with the old Mao himself. First time ever, the president of the United States. Here he's looking a little concerned about what he's eating, or I don't know what's going on here. But he's rocking the chopsticks. Shaking some hands. Shaking some other hands. Toasting. Got a lot of official dinners. Nothing really specific is done. It's more ceremonial, but that's important too. Another dinner. It really looks like Nixon is staring at the plate and going, what crap are they going to make me eat now? Wife looks confused. This chick, I don't know. So you have this official visit, and the question is, well, did he succeed? Well, it depends on how you define success. Nixon was successful at reapproachment. The PRC, the relations start to normalize, even though it will not formally extend diplomatic recognition until 1979 under Jimmy Carter. But you have this kind of, thawing of the Cold War taking place. And more importantly, it makes the Soviet Union take a look at the mirror. And it makes the Soviet Union take a look at the mirror and ask themselves, if you're going to make a difference, got to take a look at yourself, make a change. In fact, what happens is the Soviets are concerned about a potential atomic enemy on their borders, because China's got bombs by this point. And the Soviets become more willing to negotiate and talk and extend some sort of agreements with the United States. And during this time, you actually also have détente with the Soviet Union. And after years of hostility between these two sides, Nixon seeks a policy of détente. Other presidents had moments where tensions were addressed and some progress was made. But Nixon, more than any other guy, had negotiations with specific landmark treaties. Now, why diplomacy with the Soviets? It's all part of this process of realpolitik. And if you take a look at this kind of list of material, once again, the Russians are worried about a big growing threat of China. Nixon's using the leverage he has by visiting China. The Soviets want to have a conversation too. And as Henry Kissinger himself said, right now we need the Chinese to correct the Russians and to discipline the Russians. And they meet. Now, by the time Nixon's kind of 74, 73, Khrushchev's gone. All that, the Communist Party is going to have a lot of internal power struggles. Khrushchev's gone. The guy now in charge is a guy by the name of Brezhnev. And Brezhnev and Nixon meet when Nixon goes to Moscow. There he is, little Richard Nixon in Moscow. And him and Brezhnev meet, and once again, there's some awkwardness that occurs. I don't know which image is more awkward. The fact that they're on some balcony and Brezhnev seems to be whispering into President Nixon's ear and his hand is somewhere. I won't suggest or try to hypothesize where. And then you have over here, a little bubbly going. And once again, hands are interestingly unable to be seen. And Brezhnev seems to be staring intently somewhere at Nixon. I don't quite know. But the issue that Nixon and Brezhnev discussed during these cocktail hours and these romantic standing on balconies was bombs. And bombs are expensive, and the United States was building up a huge nuclear arsenal, and it was costing the U.S. taxpayers money. It was becoming very, very, very concerning to the world about the potential for atomic war. There were, Earth Day and these types of things are addressing the dangers of nuclear radiation, and they come up with some agreements that are very important called the SALT Agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And this is one of the biggest accomplishments of detente, is this Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And these talks took place actually over a series of years. It was before Nixon even went to Russia that these kind of were beginning these conversations. But when the treaty was officially signed, it limited the number of ballistic missiles with nuclear capabilities. It limited these missiles that were extraordinarily worrisome and dangerous and growing at a rapid pace. And it's a huge arms control agreement. In fact, one of the biggest strategic arms control deals during this Cold War. It slows down this escalating arms race. And Nixon and Brezhnev take credit for that and sign the paperwork and make this deal. Now this next part I'm going to rush through because it wasn't all rosy, happy days under Nixon. If you recall, Vietnam War, he escalates the war at the same time he's downsizing the war by bombing Cambodia without telling the American people or Congress. So there's that. There's a situation that happens actually in the Middle East. And for those of you that do not know, there has been a very long, tense situation between Israel and her neighbors. Israel, of course, is the Jewish country formed after World War II. There are non-Jews who live there, and many people in the Middle East and other parts of the world feel that the creation of Israel violated the rights of some individuals who happen to be living in this region. On the flip side, there are those who say that the creation of the State of Israel had, was needed and justified, and Israel has done everything in their power to accommodate the concerns of those around them. Regardless of where you stand on that, when you go to college, you're going to see stuff all the time about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What ends up happening is Israel was created in 1948. Arab nations in the region had engaged in wars with the Jewish state, trying to get rid of it, and none had opened up any diplomatic relations with Israel by the 1970s. No one had acknowledged their right to exist. And from the start, Israel was a very important ally of the United States, and we are a very important ally to Israel. In fact, to give you an idea of how important this, or how tense this conflict was, in 1967 there was the infamous Six-Day War. And basically, what ended up happening is Israel kicks the crap out of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, who had attacked Israel, hoping to get rid of Israel and reclaim land for the Arab and Palestinian people. They attacked Israel, Israel wins, and Israel expands its borders. So one of the kind of things that happens over and over again is they don't like that fact that Israel is there taking up land, and then they attack Israel and don't acknowledge Israel. Then Israel wins these wars and gets more land, which further angers them. In the meantime, the United States is a supporter of Israel, which leads to anti-U.S. feelings as well. In fact, if you take a look, the land in the yellow was original Israel, and the land in the darker kind of yellow-orange is land that was obtained as a result of the Six-Day War. So Israel is expanding their territory very, very successfully. So you have massive border expansions for Israel. Then, on one of the Jewish holidays, Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launches another surprise attack in 1973. And the Arab nations of Egypt and Syria launched this attack against Israel, hoping to regain territory lost during the 6 Days War. And once again, it was a surprise attack. Yom Kippur being a Jewish holiday, it lasted 20 days. The fighting was intense, and the United States comes to the aid of Israel in the form of military supplies. Politically and militarily, that we come to the assistance. In fact, Nixon was very, as many presidents are, very committed to the cause of defending the right of Israel to exist. What ends up happening is it kind of feels like a bit of a proxy war. What that means is America, homies with Israel, is defending and giving supplies to Israel, while Egypt and Syria are getting a tremendous amount of support from the Soviets. So even though this has really nothing to do with capitalism versus communism, it has a feeling of the Cold War as well. What ends up happening is, as a result of U.S. support, you have the Arab nations leading a massive oil embargo, which devastates the United States economy. The Arab nations declare that on October 1973, they would not sell oil to the U.S. because of its support for the State of Israel. And literally within months, the price of oil quadrupled, and there was a huge crisis in this country. And it will kind of continue on into the 1970s under other presidents. The effect of the war hurt America's relationship with other nations, namely Syria. Some of them, such as Syria, will move closer to the Soviets. The oil embargo against the U.S. will hurt our economy. Kissinger tries to kind of make nice with everybody, and he flies around, not in a space shuttle, but he flies around different Middle Eastern capitals.
I wish I could buy me a spaceship and fly.
I swear I do.
Past the sky.
I feel you, man.
And this was referred to as Henry Kissinger's Shuttle Diplomacy. And basically what it involved was him flying between different nations, trying to deal with the conflicts that were occurring. And this basically was used during the Arab-Israeli conflict during this time. He helps the U.S. along with different leaders negotiate a ceasefire. They got Israel to give up some of its territory that it had taken during these wars. The Arab nations agreed to end the oil embargo. But this is another part of this Cold War. One other thing while we're on the topic of Israel is over time you have the very famous, and one thing you should know about Jimmy Carter is the Camp David Accords, which are negotiated between Egypt, Israel, with the assistance of the United States. And they're called that because much of the discussions took place at Camp David, which is a retreat for U.S. presidents. Egypt became willing to accept and to negotiate with Israel, and Egypt becomes the first nation with the Camp David Accords to formally recognize the Jewish state. And you got Carter there with the Israeli and Egyptian leaders. Here they are once again exchanging handshakes or hand-holding thingies. Now, the other thing about Nixon is there's this idea that somehow, okay, so he goes to China, détente, SALT, strategic arms limitation, but he also at the same time, this is one of those kind of like bipolar things of the Cold War, at the same time he's talking one way, he's doing other things that are broadening the U.S. role in the Cold War. Nixon in Vietnam is one example. Another example is in Chile. And in Chile, which is in South America, this is actually what Kissinger said. I don't see why we need to stand idly by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. What was going on in Chile is the people of Chile did something crazy. They actually elected a socialist. In fact, they elected a socialist in 1970, a guy by the name of Salvador Allende. He won a democratic election. He was voted on by the people. He was a Marxist. He was not a Soviet puppet. And he's elected to be the leader of Chile. He had promised reform. He appealed to the Chilean people. And he wins. Nixon no likey. In fact, Nixon and Kissinger began plans to try to get rid of this new socialist government in South America. And the way they do that is, of course, by using the CIA. Remember, Eisenhower had done something very similar in Iran and Guatemala. Things they do, $10 million to fund the opponents of the Allende government, blocking economic loans into Chile, preventing things from getting to certain groups, giving money to groups we like. All of these things are being done. The CIA is heavily involved, spending millions of dollars for anti-communists in the rural regions of Chile. And in 1973, the U.S., not directly there, helped stage a coup. And the guy here's Salvador Allende, a guy by the name of Augusto Pinochet, a military leader with U.S. backing, overthrows the government of Allende. Pinochet, there he is right there, establishes a military dictatorship that will last for over a decade. Thousands of Chileans will be killed. Freedom, democracy, things like that are completely cut off. And Chile falls into just a decay politically and civil rights and things like that. Allende is, I believe, killed during this situation. Pinochet is in power. And basically the U.S. reopens economic aid to Pinochet, aid that was closed off from Allende, and Pinochet rises to power. Pinochet is going to be very conservative, militaristic, and many atrocities are going to be committed against the Chilean people under his regime. So, once again, realpolitik, Nixon doing things like this, a lot of people look back and frown upon the Nixon's administration's foreign policy. So keep that in mind. I don't think they're going to ask you a Nixon question directly, especially DBQ, because that's what last year was, but know about the different parts of Nixon. Evaluating Nixon, like I said, you have the strategic arms, peaceful negotiations with China and the Soviets. You did have a reduction of U.S. commitment abroad. You had the peace with honor in Vietnam, which basically gets us out of Vietnam, but the Vietnam War fails. And on the flip side, though, you do have increased involvement in places such as Chile, such as in the Middle East during the Yom Kippur War. You have continued Cold War crises continuing. And, of course, you can't ignore the domestic policies of Nixon and his spying on opponents and things like that. That is all the foreign policy stuff I'm going to get into. Just off the top of my head, foreign policy stuff you may want to kind of focus on. Clinton, don't ask hotel, gays in the military, don't say you're gay and you can go in the military. That's controversial still. Reagan, Star Wars was building missile defense system in outer space. Had nothing to do with actual Star Wars, but basically building missile systems into space. That way if the Soviets launched a missile, we could shoot it out of the sky. It was criticized. It cost a lot of money. Was seen as impractical. Carter, know about the oil crisis, the Iran-Contra crisis, things like that, blah, blah, blah. Persian Gulf War under George Bush the first, other things. Read your blue book. All right, good luck, goodbye.